put up with lower pay and ridiculous working hours. That's love of labour turned against itself. What's another example? And I said I could think of tons and my mind's gone blank. I guess love of country in terms of soldiers, love of their comrades. This kind of love of each other is nurtured so that you will better serve the machine in which you're put into. That's an example. Yes. And this kind of places us in a double bind, I think. I think it's a really interesting problem that must be explored, even though it's difficult. Because what do you say then? Do you say to a girl who's in love with a guy, like, stop loving him, like, love is bad, like, you shouldn't do that? Or do you say, like, to the teacher, like, stop working? And the kind of fundamental problem, the sort of the seriousness of the problem, I think, is how to say this. The seriousness of the problem is that I think that love and labour and love and living, all these three things are kind of inextricably linked. So that if you say, stop loving, what then is left? Like, how do I carry on? And if you say, stop working, that's almost the same as saying, stop loving, because love is a form of work, living is a form of work. How do we deal with the compromised circumstances of our existence? So that's the position that men are in. And I think this, in terms of like the gossip that we hear every day about relationships, I think that this is fascinating. I think that we find ourselves sort of saying things like, oh, he did a really like shit thing on this date, like it made me really uncomfortable, but I think he's a nice guy, I really like him. That kind of paradox. And I think that both sides of those have weight. I just saw someone like and I think that this is where conversation comes in, because we can express both of these sides and we don't have to necessarily resolve them. And so I would suggest a kind of a term for this kind of conversation, not as a form of healing conversation, because I don't think that healing is possible or even desirable, because it implies kind of a covering over or a sort of fixing that makes the wound invisible and as if it never existed. I don't think that can ever happen. There's like a really good line in a Chris Marker film where he's like, some people say that time heals all wounds, when the thing that's closer to the truth is to say that time heals everything but the wound, because the context of the way in which you are wounded may disappear, but you are left with the feeling of pain without that context, or separated from that context. That's a little bit tangential, I'm really sorry. Also, am I really like running over time? I feel like I'm talking too much. Okay, cool. Anyway, back to these heterosexual relationships that I'm talking about, because it comes in terms of this conflict between genders. I think that it is something in the power of men, in white heterosexual cis men, that they will never or very rarely encounter situations in which the world and the way that they want the world to be are misaligned. So that it is very easy for said like conventional man to go through life easily, and by that I mean never encountering a situation in which somehow he's made aware that what he wants and the way that the world is are two different things. Whereas for women, we go through, or any oppressed group, though I'm kind of using, for any oppressed group, you go through life constantly facing up to that realization, and that's a constant process of wounding. And so I'm suggesting that conversation between women is a process of repair, and I use repair very kind of carefully and precisely here to mean you have a tear in your clothing and you sew it up to make sure that the tear doesn't get bigger, and to make sure that the wind doesn't blow through the tear to kind of chill you and to make you ill or to make things worse. But the stitching is still visible, and the process of stitching means cutting into that fabric again and inflicting more pain on yourself. Because it's difficult to talk about the things that have hurt us, but it's also, I think, highly necessary. Secondly, I think, sorry, my mouth is getting so dry. I think that there's another power in women's conversation whereby we are, I should start that bit again. In our minds, there is no sense of time that is not amenable to us. And by that I mean we live in a present moment where our ideas of the future and our memories of the past all contribute to structure our experience of the present. And I think that in the kind of flexibility of women's conversation, you find this. You find this wonderful willingness not to let things go that happened in the past, to kind of bring them back and say, like, I understand that this is still affecting you, and understand the ways in which this is still affecting you. And I understand that your hopes for the future, the way that you anticipate your will being kind of contradicted in that way, is also important. There's a bit in the Odyssey, I'm classicist. There's a bit in the Odyssey where famously Penelope weaves and unweaves her this funeral shroud for Odysseus' father, and in doing so she unweaves the past in order to hold off the future and thereby maintain a fragile present. And to me, like, that is an example of a woman with no one to talk to, instead kind of investing that kind of holding things together into practical handicraft. That wasn't even funny. And I think another thing is that women's conversation is also the documentation of our histories. I went to see a film recently about the women's art movement, and one of the women in it said, the problem is that while men are making art, they're also documenting their own art and creating their own art histories. Women have never done that, and I was kind of like, well, that's true. Like, women have never had access to the making of conventional history, but we must understand, if we are to understand our place in the world, that women have always been making their histories among themselves. You know that thing that went round on Facebook quite recently, which was like, women own the void. Back up, fuckers. I think that has so much truth in what, or relevance to what I'm trying to say. We own everything that is not allowed into conventional discourse. And by that I mean we can read a book which is written by a man about men, and we can imagine all the women who are not present in that story, and that in itself is a kind of act of resistance. There's a wonderful quote I'd like to read, and then I am finishing up, I promise. This is by Hannah Black. Our liberation does not have to be grounded in any preceding factual reality, I told them. The question of the liberation of women does not have to found itself on an existing historical matriarchy, any more than the question of liberation of black people has to begin from the superiority of African cultures. Maybe every bad thing ever said about us is true, and the bad things that are said of us are not said by the private gossip, but by the public state. And we still want to live in sunlight or salt water, and this is as factual as the airport border where the interior of the head feels clean and dry, exhausted. To sort of wind up, there's a wonderful quote by John Berger where he says, and I can read it because I have noted it down, "A mistake is more hated than an enemy. Mistakes do not surrender as enemies do. There's no such thing as a defeated mistake. Mistakes either exist or they don't. And if they do, they have to be covered over, and we are their mistake. Never forget that. And so I think this is the final power of women's conversation, which is to admit our vulnerabilities, the love that has turned against us, and admit it and share it between us and make something of it, and say that actually it's not bad to be in pain, it's not bad to suffer or be vulnerable, or it is, but we can reclaim our own suffering, is what I'm suggesting. Finally, another quote by Eve Sedgwick. It is strange, the way the art of our necessity makes precious the vile things, the finger's breadth by finger's breadth dearly bought knowledge of the body's lived humiliations, dependencies, vicarities. So yeah, I hope I've made like some kind of sense along the way.